The following podcast was produced by Big Head Amusements for KQEK.com. Classically trained composer and musician Ronen Landa has tackled a multitude of genres in film, television, and other media streams. But his best-known work is perhaps in the horror realm, scoring projects for writer-director Nicholas McCarthy, including The Pact and his new release, Home. In our conversation, Rona describes his collaborations with McCarthy, scoring the comedy Cavemen, and being influenced by a certain well-known Italian composer. I wonder if we could maybe start with how you got into film scoring and whether it was something that you had always intended on doing.
It is not something I had always intended on doing. For me, it's interesting. I kind of fell into it a little bit backwards because, I didn't grow up as some great lover of scores and, John Williams obsessee or anything like that. But, I kind of wanted to be a rock and roller as a young kid and played in bands and, studied a little jazz, studied all kinds of things. And when I got to college, I started studying the classical repertoire and started learning about all these interesting composers. And at the same time, while I was in New York, I started exploring the downtown improvisation scene, kind of spearheaded by John Zorn. And an album that became very influential to me was John Zorn's The Big Gun Down, which is essentially an album full of Ennio Morricone covers done John Zorn style. And from there, it was very interesting. At a certain point, I realized, I should probably check out this Morricone guy. And started listening to Ennio Morricone and fell in love with his music. And since I'd been studying music kind of in a more traditional capacity at Columbia, it seemed kind of natural to start investigating film scoring as a potential outlet for my musical expression. So I guess I always like to say I fell into it backwards. That's what it seems like to me.
Were you interested in any other composers, especially any other Italian composers? Because Morricone was very indicative of the style and quality of composing that was coming out of Italy, and there was a marked difference between his approach in scoring and what was happening, say, in Britain and the United States.
Oh, I mean, the difference is just palpable. For me, Morricone kind of represents this much more bold experimentalist approach to creating music, and so he's been a huge influence on me. Oddly, I would say that a lot of my influences from Europe tend to be French, not just in film music, but also classically. I mean, I've always just been a great fan of Debussy and Ravel and Messiaen, and I would actually kind of consider Stravinsky a French composer because I think his style kind of reflects more of his years in Paris than it does really a Russian style in some ways.
In citing Morricone, I guess, to me that kind of explains some of the sounds that I hear in Home, because
I'll take that as a compliment.
I guess what stands out for me is a contrast that you managed to get out of the piano, because if you look at a piano in terms of its identity, it's often used for melodic material, for very warm sounds, but then if you flip open the top, you have all these other sounds, these often horrific sounds that you can create by just using the strings and the innards of it, and it's kind of interesting how that contrasts just under the cover.
It is an interesting contrast, and we use the piano both ways in this score. With the piano, it played a major role in both its kind of manifestations, as you put it. So the internal stuff that we did got to be pretty interesting. I actually worked with a pianist, and we just sat there for a recording session and experimented and improvised. And this was actually kind of fundamental to the way we made a lot of these sounds in the score, was working through kind of planned ideas and improvisations with these wonderful musicians and finding interesting sounds that I could then incorporate into the architecture of the score.
And then for the score, how did you actually approach it? Was it something that had, let's say, some concrete themes that you had already written down, or was there a different way that you sort of tackled the score?
The scary music in this score was really constructed in this very unusual contemporary way where, just like I was mentioning, we worked with musicians, and often I brought them some fragmentary melodies or some fragmentary improvisational structures that we could work in, and we created lots of interesting sounds that I then, after I created this, essentially a huge bank of sounds, I would approach each cue and work with all these recordings to find ways to layer in these sounds in a way that worked with the drama. At the same time, there are melodic components to the score, and those were, I would say, done more traditionally, as in the sense that they were demoed and approved and ultimately recorded later.
And this is your second film with Nicholas McCarthy, right?
It's actually my second feature. It's our third project together. We did a short film.
And then in terms of your relationship with him in collaborating, perhaps you can describe sort of what he brings to you in terms of what he challenges you to compose, because I gather that his films must be significantly different from some of the other horror films that are out there. I understand that he likes to play with sort of lighting and mood and ambience, both visually and sonically.
Yeah, absolutely. He's not really coming from the school of, let's just throw as much blood up there as we possibly can and disgust people or just shock them, without some kind of motivation there. So he's coming from a kind of something of a more intellectual approach. And Nick has been absolutely amazing to collaborate with. Frankly, it's been quite an experience for me. He knows the genre. He knows it so well. He knows it in and out. He knows all cinema so well, and he knows film music very well, which can be a challenge for a composer to work with a director when I'm not the only expert in the room. What he's been able to do is help me shape a lot of these kind of experimentalist ideas that I have as a composer, and help me mold them and shape them to accentuate the cinema. And he's really something of a master at that, because he gives me the creative license to really bring my creative ideas to the fore and really try different things out. And he's very open to those. And at the same time, we work together to really make sure the shape of these cues is going to have the maximum impact on the audience.
What I thought was really fascinating about the score is it seemed as though most of the sounds that you use originate from organic sources. And if there was any kind of digital treatment that was used, you were very careful in the way that you applied it, because you always made sure that the organic sounds were the ones that were up front. Any kind of processing was very slight, but it was there just enough to make it very unsettling.
The things that sound electronic in this score are very often things like flutes and clarinets being run through distortion processing, or violins going through crazy pitch shifters or things like that, which creates a very uncanny sense, because you are dealing with a sound that you're almost familiar with and then something is strange with it. At the same time, both Nick and myself, we're both really committed to live instruments.
And then in your background, you scored shorts, dramas, horror, television, and documentaries. And I wonder if you have any particular preference or affinity for a specific genre.
In a weird way, I have an affinity for all of them. All of them bring out different sides of my musical being and of my creativity and of my musical experience. I just scored a romantic comedy, which, the music could not have been more different from this score for Home. But it was, basically a rock and roll score. But like I told you, when I was a kid, I wanted to be playing bands and be a touring rock and roller. which, for the most part is something that I've left aside. But getting a chance to reconnect with that and have fun with that music, it was just great. Horror films absolutely tickle the experimentalist and the avant-gardist in me. I've always been influenced by those composers who pushed the envelope and tried new things. And so to be working in a genre that allows me to do that is, of course, fantastic. And, dramas are wonderful, too, because, we have to pull at the heartstrings. And music is so much about getting in touch with our emotions and really feeling in a fundamental way.
Well, and I think another thing that really benefits composers now is that it's no longer the exception where a soundtrack is given a release, because there's pretty much any way that you can release one now. You can either do it from iTunes, you can do it through Amazon, it can be custom press CDs. But it's nice to know that, I guess, as long as it's built into a prior agreement of the contract, that there's a good chance your music can get released so that at least people can enjoy it.
I think the reason that I didn't, say, pursue a career in academia, where they're creating absolutely incredible music that I find totally fascinating. But part of the reason I didn't pursue a career there was because I felt that there was a problem of reach. And, I became a musician because other music that I'd been exposed to had touched me so deeply and moved me. And I just wanted the opportunity to help other people feel that way too. And so it's very important to me that the music gets out there and that people have a chance to experience it.
With Morricone, I'm just curious if you ever heard any of his work that he did with an experimental group. They've got a very long name in Italian, but I think the short form is just they were known as the Group.
Yes, I have. That's just completely amazing music.
Yeah.
Morricone is interesting, and Nick and I have talked extensively about Morricone and listened extensively to Morricone, and he's had such an influence on these scores, both because of his actual music, some of his more obscure horror films from the 70s. To both of us, he represents someone who's willing to think a little strange and be a little weird and not be boxed in by what's come before. And that's kind of been a guiding light to us.
Music from the Pact is available from Moviescore Media. A compilation album featuring song and score tracks from the comedy Cavemen is available from Lakeshore Records. Music from his latest score, Home, will be released soon in 2014. For reviews, further interviews, and additional information, please visit KQEK.com. For podcasting services, including editing and mixing, please visit the Multimedia Skills section at mondomark.com for further information plus media samples. This program is copyrighted 2014 by Mark R. Hassan.